when we make a great icon of someone like Newton, for instance, or Darwin, and those are the two male scientists who I've worked on, there are always people in their shadow. And I guess what I've done over the years is I've been interested in looking at the shadows of great men and what those shadows hide. So, for instance, when I worked on Newton, I became more and more interested in his alchemy. Alchemy was something that the historians of Newton were embarrassed by sometimes, didn't really want to write about, but Newton had written 1/6 of his work was alchemical in nature. And that meant that he was part of this big network of alchemists who were bringing him manuscripts, people who he was talking to, people he was receiving information from, people who were part of his discoveries. Newton's a very isolated scientist in lots of ways, but nonetheless he was part of a network. And there was something about the way in which we had made icons of these men, Newton and Darwin, that meant that we weren't seeing the people in the shadows. And I think that's one of the features of my work, is that I'm interested in where the missing people are, where the absent spaces are, who are the people, the little people who these great men have been talking to. I call them ghosts partly because when I was working on Darwin for my Darwin and the Barnacle book, I read a lot, spent a lot of time thinking about what the world looked like for him in the period running up to publishing The Origin of Species. So I became very attuned to his letters and the kind of language he used, to picking up when he was feeling anxious. And there was not a lot that made him anxious, but one of the things he became anxious about as he ran up to publishing Origin of Species was the fact that he wasn't sure who his predecessors were. And at the time there was a protocol, if you wrote a big book like Origin of Species or a book on geology, that you began your book with a kind of preface or a historical sketch, people called it different things, in which you paid homage to the people who had walked the road that you were walking before you. So all the people who had contributed to the long history of your field, if you like, before you. And Darwin wanted to know who those people were, but he wasn't very sure. It wasn't a question of influence or that he had borrowed ideas from earlier people. It's just that he didn't really know who the people were who'd had evolutionary ideas before him. He'd started a list, he'd abandoned it, he'd added people, he'd taken them off the list, and then he published Origin without that list because he wasn't sure that he had the right people on it. And then people started to criticize him for it. A very large number of the people who I studied, and remember my book covers 2,200 years, so there's a lot of very different conditions that I studied across that time. But a lot of the people who I studied, particularly from the 17th century onward through the Enlightenment into the 19th century, were taking enormous risks with their speculation around evolution, mutability of species, let's say in its broadest term. Because to entertain those ideas was to be atheistic, potentially, or to be accused of being an atheist, to be accused of being a heretic. That's to have an idea that was against church teaching. And so many of my people were, many of the people I studied, like Diderot and Erasmus Darwin and so on, were having to find ways of articulating their ideas in such a way that they would not get into trouble with the police or with the church, or in fact be hauled into prison to be interrogated for heretical ideas. Clearly what is happening here is marvelous because, you know, I've talked to first year students, postdocs here, and I've talked to people who are on their way out who've been here for 2 or 3 years, and the first year students are talking about opening up their projects, forming new questions that are much bigger and bolder. But the third year students are talking to more the people who've been here 3 or 4 years, are clearly able to be very skeptical about paradigms and about the language of their own disciplinary center, if you like, And I mean, I've witnessed this several times in the last 24 hours, where people who've been here a long time seem to be very keen to challenge concepts, categories, language. You know, what does that mean? What do you really mean by that? And what does that mean in your discipline? You know, the linguistic and conceptual flexibility is evident to me in talking to people who've been here for several years.